Hi and welcome everybody. This is the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series. I'm glad to have all of you again today. Just a word about upcoming events. This is the last presentation of our speaker series this quarter. And we will resume next January, starting with talks on the effects of COVID on rental eviction moratoria and why kids need recess. So before I introduce our program director for the day, a word about questions. For this session, we won't have live questions. Rather, please type in your questions into the Q&A portion of Zoom at any time, and center staff, along with our moderator, will help distribute them so they're answered at an appropriate time in the program. But do type in your questions in an ongoing way. Now to introduce the chair of today's session, Paul Hastings. Paul is no stranger to UCCS. He's also professor of psychology at UC Davis, where he served as chair of psychology and also interim dean of the School of Education. He completed his bachelor's degree at McGill University and his PhD at the University of Toronto. He's a member of the UC Consortium on the Developmental Science of Adolescence, the Center for Poverty Research, and the Center for Mind and Brain, where he directs the Healthy Emotions, Relationships, and Development Laboratory. So today, as always, Professor Hastings brings deep knowledge and engagement with the science of healthy adolescent development, and I'm really pleased to welcome him and his colleagues to UCCS. Professor Hastings to introduce this special session, which, by the way, is co-sponsored with the UC Adolescents Consortium. So, Paul, take it away.
Thank you, Richard. I really appreciate that. And I'd like to thank you and your team at UC Center Sacramento, including Cindy, Sandra, Brooke, and your colleagues for your outstanding efforts to keep bringing us these important platforms for sharing knowledge during these really challenging conditions that we're continuing to experience. Looking forward to the days when we're doing this again in person. Thank you as well to everyone who's joining us online for today's live webinar titled Friendships, Identity, and Well-Being Among Diverse California Youth and Implications for Life After the COVID-19 Pandemic. As Richard said, with the support of UC Center Sacramento, this webinar is the 7th in a series of panel presentations by members of the UC Consortium on the Developmental Science of Adolescence. The consortium was founded 8 years ago and has benefited from the continuing support of the UC Office of the President's Multi-Campus Research Programs and Initiatives mechanism. The consortium brings together faculty and graduate students in psychology, public health, education, human development, medicine, and other fields from 5 UC campuses to share their expertise in pursuing, teaching, and applying an integrative, interdisciplinary approach to understanding adolescent development. Today, I'm very happy to be introducing Drs. Adrian Nishina and Phil Hammock. Dr. Adrian Nishina is a professor in the Department of Human Ecology and Vice Chair of the Human Development and Family Studies graduate program at the University of California, Davis. She completed her doctoral studies in developmental psychology at UCLA in 2002 and joined the faculty at UC Davis in 2006. Dr. Nishina directs the Peer Relations Lab, in which she and her students focus their research on peer relationships during adolescence and emerging adulthood, that period of sort of 18 to 28 that characterizes the transition into adulthood and full, what we think of as autonomy and independence from prior backgrounds. Specifically, Dr. Nishina examines young people's exposure to peers from diverse ethnic backgrounds in the context of schools and how these critical social experiences across communities are connected to their current and future academic, psychological, and social and physical well-being. Her work has been supported by IES, the Institute of Educational Sciences, and other agencies. Dr. Phil Hammock is professor and chair of psychology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Hammock completed his doctoral studies in cultural psychology at the University of Chicago in 2006 and joined the faculty at UC Santa Cruz in 2007. He's received numerous awards for his work, including the Ed Cairns Early Career Award from the American Psychological Association's Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence. At UC Santa Cruz, Dr. Hammock directs the Gender and Sexual Diversity Laboratory, in which he examines gender and sexual diversity in cultural and historical contexts. This work has been supported by numerous sources, including NICHD, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Our panelists are planning to save a good amount of time for an engaged discussion, so I'll ask you to type your questions into the Q&A app in Zoom, as Richard suggested, and we will engage with the questions after our speakers have completed both of their talks. And in order to give them and you as much time as possible, I'll wrap up my introduction by thanking both of the speakers in advance and asking all of you to join me in welcoming Dr. Adrienne Nishina to the microphone.
Thank you so much, Paul, for your introductions, and thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm very excited to be talking to you about some of the work that I'm doing and about diversity in schools and how diversity, in particular racial and ethnic diversity, can be used as a resource. I'm very much a product of California. I went to California public schools and universities for my entire educational career. And as you can see at UC Davis, I remain at one today. Just a little bit about me. I grew up and went to high school in Long Beach. It's a city just about 30 miles south of downtown Los Angeles. And at the time I attended this high school, it was one of the most racially and ethnically diverse high schools in the state. Diversity was just kind of baked into the school's identity. And so I was aware of it, but I didn't really think about how it might be impacting me. I was just immersed in it. I hung out with my friends who were from different backgrounds, and I interacted with them daily. Diversity is becoming an increasingly important topic of daily and kind of educational discourse, but as well as discourse in our broader society. And this is in part because of changing demographics. So I'm just going to present some brief statistics for you about California. And from the 2020 census, California is the most populous state in the country and is actually the second most diverse state in the country. So it has a diversity index of almost 70%, which means that if you randomly select two people from California, there's a 70% chance they would be from a different ethnic or racial background. In comparison, in the US as a whole, the diversity index is only 61%. And that actually is a big increase from the diversity index in 2010 in the US as a whole, which was only around 55%. So back only 10 years ago, if you were to randomly select two people from the US, there's only a 55% chance they would be from a different ethnic background. So at the same time we've seen changes in demographics, we've also seen changes in workforce needs. And so depending on where you look, it could be US Chamber of Commerce or World Economic Forum, the Pew Research Center, all of these forward-looking entities have come up with some similar themes about the needs for future workers. And a lot of them center around issues related to adjacent to diversity. So these are things like working with people who are different from you, working with a wide range of individuals, problem solving and critical thinking, creativity and innovation. So these are all things that are emphasized for the future and what workers will need as critical skills. I should also note that jobs that include or involve social interactions are actually quite robust to automation. So these jobs involving social interactions are less likely to fall prey to automation in the future. So California's diversity really sets the stage for skill building opportunities for today's youth that can ultimately give them a leg up towards these important workforce skills in the future. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how that works and then show you some research findings primarily based on samples in California. So just briefly, there's expected to be this cascade effect. So when individuals, and in particular youth, are presented with opportunities to interact with peers who are from different ethnic backgrounds as them, they then will have these interactions. And in some cases, these interactions are expected to lead to friendships and close friendships. And so when we interact with people who are different from us, we find that that's usually a novel experience, and we experience these discrepancies from prior experiences. So kind of the analogy I like to give is if you've ever traveled to a new city or maybe a new country, when you first get there, everything is new and novel, and there's differences from what you're used to. And not surprisingly, that can be initially associated with cognitive stress. But over time, over repeated exposures, and once you've had time to get used to a new city, and in this case, once kids have had more experiences interacting with people who are different from them, that cognitive stress gives way to reconciliation and really incorporating all of this new information into their broader understanding of the world. And it's that process of reconciliation that can lead to important things that I talked about in terms of future workforce skills, like complex thinking skills, creativity, and importantly, decreased anxiety. So one of the biggest inhibitors for people, in particular adults, from interacting with those who are different from them is this sense of an anxiety. But when individuals have practiced interacting with people and have prior experiences interacting with people who are different from them, they go into these cross-group interactions with decreased anxiety and more open to those interactions. So my argument today is going to be that schools play an important role in giving youth these social experiences. So why schools? Well, first, we can shape school composition. So it's a lot easier to move students around to different schools than it would be to have people move around in terms of neighborhoods. But beyond that, we might not even have to move students to different schools. Schools themselves can capitalize on their own diversity by ensuring that their classes are reflective of the diversity of the school as a whole. We also know that the good news is that we can shape students' experiences in school and classroom contexts. And so, especially during adolescence, we know that teens are really interested in interacting with peers and with friends. And so when we provide them with the opportunities to do so, and we provide them with a positive climate, they can probably do most of the rest of the work themselves. We just have to give them those opportunities and repeated exposures to those who are different from them. And last, I think schools are particularly important because in California, only 65% of students ultimately enroll in college. So high schools actually may be our last big opportunity to give a wide spread of the population these diversity experiences. As I mentioned, it's much more difficult to get these diversity experiences later as an adult, both because of limited opportunities as well as anxiety associated with these novel interactions. So let me tell you what these students may be gaining in these diverse interactions and diverse contexts. Again, I'm going to focus primarily on work that I've done and colleagues have done in California with large diverse student populations. So the first finding, and this finding has been replicated in multiple studies now with large diverse samples across many schools, is that student diversity promotes important school outcomes and student outcomes, such as less feelings of loneliness, feeling kids who are more diverse schools and more diverse classrooms feel less bullied, and they feel safer in their school. And importantly, these findings are similarly true across ethnic groups. So the impact of diversity seems to be similar regardless of the student's individual ethnic background. And now you can imagine that if you are in a work context where you feel less lonely, less picked on, and safer, that's going to really support your productivity and success. And so the same is true for students in school settings. So this is some work that I've done with my former grad student, Jakeem Lewis, and a former postdoc, Alicia Ramirez Hall. And we looked at middle school students' experiences with cross-ethnic peers during middle school. And what we found is that when students more frequently interact with cross-ethnic peers during lunchtime in middle school, they actually have higher end-of-year GPAs, and their teachers estimate those students will have higher educational attainment. So they'll go on to graduate high school and college and beyond. And importantly, these findings are above and beyond interactions with same ethnicity peers. So it's not to say that same ethnicity peer interactions are not important. In fact, they are quite important and crucial for adolescents' development, but these findings are just bonus. They're above and beyond the benefits of interacting with people who are similar to you. We find the same things when we look at high school samples. So this is some work that I'm doing with Michael Medina, who's my current postdoc. And in high school settings, we're finding similar things. So on days in which students interact during lunchtime with cross-ethnic peers, again, above and beyond their same ethnicity interactions, they report engaging in more STEM-related behaviors. These are things like thinking about a math or science problem, talking to a peer about science and math, or something that they learned in class. And we know that this is particularly important because STEM is a field that is increasing in opportunities, but also still can benefit from increased diversity. And finally, we're finding that the social experiences that peers or students are having during high school can even carry over to the transition into college. So this is some work that I've done with Alicia Ramirez Hall, former postdoc, and Jakeem Lewis. And we were finding that students who had more diverse friendship groups in high school, when they transitioned to college, they reported more higher levels of STEM efficacy. So they were more likely to believe that they could succeed in science and math courses. And they were also more likely to report that they would major in some sort of STEM major. It also protected them. So having more diverse friends back in high school protected them against more current discrimination experiences when they were deciding whether they should major in a STEM field or not. And similar to all the other findings, these findings were similar regardless of which ethnic group we were looking at. So now we know that it might not be feasible to try to force kids to become friends with each other. That wouldn't really work, and it certainly wouldn't work for adolescents. But some more recent work by my current grad student, Cheng Vang, suggests that it might be a little bit more simple than that. So I've suggested that diversity can be malleable as a context. And it might just be that we can also create the positive interethnic climate that then goes on to support youth's friendships with peers from diverse backgrounds. So in his work with high school students, he's finding that when students feel that their high school is providing a positive interethnic climate, such as having teachers that encourage students to interact with peers or classmates who are different from them, when the the student body as a whole, it remains open to cross-ethnic interactions. When the school celebrates holidays and from different cultures, this positive interethnic climate predicts a stronger sense of school belonging, meaning that students really feel like they're part of that school. And in turn, the sense of school belonging is associated with all of the things that we would want our students to have. So better well-being, so less depression, less anxiety, more self-esteem. They also report feeling less sick or getting sick less often, and higher GPAs. So by shaping the interethnic climate or climate related to diversity in school settings, we can really set the stage for our students in a range of important positive youth outcomes. So finally, I'm going to present some kind of early findings related to COVID that I think really illustrate why attending to diversity might be especially important as we transition back into in-person schooling. For better or worse, one of our studies was disrupted by the pandemic. So we have information from both what they were doing before the pandemics and in-person learning situations to what they were doing during remote education. And you yourselves can think back to how you personally adapted when we started social distancing. Many of us closed in to our most important or closest friendships. But simultaneously really missed having those more incidental daily social interactions that were no longer as feasible when we were all working and learning remotely. The same is true for students as well. So this is some work in collaboration with Michael Medina and Cheng Fang. And we were finding that as students shifted to remote learning, they were spending less time in peer interactions as a whole, which is not surprising. The good news was that they were reporting then less peer conflict, but also, unfortunately, less support from peers. And while they were increasing online interactions with peers, again, not surprisingly, the amount of time, though, that they were spending interacting with peers online did not even come close to the amount of time they would have been spending in person in interactions during in-school learning. And so, for example, I showed how important lunchtime interactions might be for students. And as students transition to online learning, they were much less likely to eat lunch with any peers. And if they did report eating lunch with a peer, again, remotely, it was only one peer. So they were not as probably their close friend, not this broader group of students in which they were interacting. And so we did collect some data. So not surprisingly, if kids are reducing their social interactions in the context of COVID, they were also reducing, in particular, their opportunities and interactions with cross-ethnic peers. So these are two separate studies and samples. One, we had information on students when they were in high school and in-person learning compared to college, their first year of college in remote learning. And in comparison, they were reporting significantly fewer daily diversity-related interactions in the remote learning context than they were pre-pandemic. Of course, that also spans a transition to college. So we also had another sample of STEM students, STEM majors, that we had data on from their sophomore year when they were in-person learning to their fourth year in college, their senior year when they were learning remotely. And similarly, they reported significant decreases in their daily diversity interactions. So moving forward, it's going to be really important to think about if and when we do shift to remote learning again, how to minimize some of this impact on students' social experiences. So just briefly, take-home messages are that California's diversity as a natural resource. We can use California's diversity as a natural resource to promote positive outcomes for all youth. So not just white youth or ethnic minority youth. Schools are an ideal context for these diverse experiences for a host of reasons, both in terms of where students are developmentally, as well as the particular context and ways in which schools can shape students' experiences. And that these diversity experiences and skill building opportunities now can really help to promote a future skilled workforce. I should note that one of the things that is emerging with young people currently in their decisions on in terms of which company to work for, diversity has emerged as something that they are looking for in terms of the climate of their future careers and their future job climate. And so as that becomes an increased demand of the workforce, companies will continue to adapt to that and address these issues, and it'll become even more important for our students to have those diversity experiences and build those skills up while they're still in high school and school in general. So with that, I would like to just acknowledge my funding sources, as well as collaborators across many different projects and the student research assistants currently in my research lab. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Adrian. That was super. And I just want to put a reminder to people. I see a couple of people raised hands. Please type your questions into the question and answer box on Zoom, and we'll have a collected question and answer period at the end of the session. And I'll ask Dr. Hammock to please get his slides ready. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Hammock.
Okay, hopefully people can see my screen, and I'll go ahead and get started. So thank you very much for the invitation, Paul. I want to thank all the staff at UC Center Sacramento and my colleague who just spoke as well. I think these are nice complementary pairings actually of talks, not surprisingly. And the title of my presentation is Sexual and Gender Diversity Among California Teens, How Communities Shape Identity and Mental Health in Politically Conservative and Progressive Regions. Now let me see if I can advance. There we go. So the goals of my talk today are three goals. First of all, to place gender and sexual identity development for today's adolescents in a cultural and historical context, to share three big stories from my research with LGBTQ teens in politically diverse regions of the state, and to suggest some concrete actions that I think might benefit the health and development of California teens based on this research so far. And so let's begin with this timeline to kind of take us through history and sort of see where we are today. I want to note that today's adolescents and emerging adults are members of Generation Z. They were born roughly at the start of the century. And the data I'm presenting today was collected before the pandemic. Now, throughout the childhood and adolescence of this birth cohort, as I just put up a few pieces of the timeline now, there was heightened attention to issues of sexual diversity, especially with regard to marriage equality, but also to some issues that were social justice legacies of the 20th century, such as the repeal of state sodomy laws. But folks here in California may remember especially Proposition 8, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a couple minutes. And so this was occurring in the childhood of this birth cohort. So there was sort of in the air, this kind of conversation around marriage equality. Now, also in the childhood of this cohort, we do see the beginnings of transgender visibility, as well as greater visibility for asexuality, and the addition of some new terminology, including pansexual and polyamory, into the Oxford English Dictionary. And I think this was really signifying a shift in language that was starting to occur early in this century. And by the middle childhood and early adolescence of this cohort, we saw heightened attention to the problem of bullying LGBT youth, several high-profile suicides actually in 2010. And around 2011, we start to see greater visibility and discussion around kink. And then 2013, we really start to see a huge uptick in transgender visibility and recognition, just as the marriage equality issue is resolved in 2015. And we start to see for the first time that a majority of Americans actually support marriage equality. And so this is a pretty significant shift, while members of this cohort are, again, roughly in adolescence. Now, things are starting to kind of look like they're going in a particular trajectory with regard to recognition of gender and sexual diversity. And then there's the election of Donald Trump, signified here with an orange explosion. And I want to note that that really the Trump administration and this election, although certainly causing tremendous stress for many with minoritized gender and sexual identities, does not really end up stopping the pace of this revolution that I argue has been underway this century. In particular, it's during the Trump years that we see recognition and visibility for non-binary gender quite a bit. Now, of course, there is regression during this period with things like the transgender military ban, but there's something extremely significant going on throughout this century that I have not yet put on this timeline, and is very, very central to the experience of this cohort and adolescents in general, and that is social media. So it's really during this century in which we see social media invented as a concept, and this really shifts the entire sort of sources of authority for young people, instead of kind of having to turn to traditional sources like their parents, their teachers, and members of my generation, print encyclopedias. They can now go to one another through social media, and of course other resources available on the internet as well, to kind of get information about gender and sexual diversity. And so the availability of these tools to communicate with one another, irrespective of their specific community and the political setting of that community, I think has actually made an enormous difference on the development of members of this birth cohort. And I'll get into that a little bit more in the presentation. Now, more recently, we've seen some increased censorship on some of these platforms coming from some anti-sex trafficking law that, for example, has impacted sort of which platforms are more widely used by young people. For example, pretty significant reduction in usage of Tumblr compared to when I first started the research, when Tumblr was really like the safe space for queer youth. So that's just an example of how the century, across the century, we've seen some changes. And of course, now we're living in the midst of a pandemic, the election of a new, more supportive administration in Washington. And just recently, a discovery by Gallup of an official uptick in LGBT identification for members of this generation. But of course, we've also seen in this era some significant anti-trans legislation in various states. Arkansas, for example, earlier this year, recently passed a law prohibiting any kind of gender affirmative medical care to those under 18. So I do think gender and gender diversity is very much where the social justice kind of work continues to occur. But so my goal in presenting this was to really kind of help contextualize this particular generation of adolescents and early emerging adults and their unique experience developmentally. So with this kind of backdrop, I want to share three big stories with you that are coming from my research. The first, probably not surprising, given the way I've just kind of positioned this birth cohort. I've really come to view what's happening now as revolutionary with regard to gender and sexuality, but there are important nuances, by which I mean this revolution is really not affecting all teens equally, and that really came out in my research. So I'll say a little bit more about that. The second big story is that just because there is this revolution, which is generally a positive thing, doesn't mean that LGBTQ youth aren't struggling in the midst of stigma, regardless of where they live. And finally, the role of community is complex and expansive in ways that are distinct from prior generations. But I do think that what we do in schools and communities can make a difference in their lives. If you listen to what young people say, this is very much their story. And so I want to share some of that with you today. So the project in which I undertook to really look at diversity across the state was called the C3 Project, California Community Climates Project. And this was funded by the William T. Grant Foundation and based here at UC Santa Cruz. Now, what did we do? Now, this project was motivated by the recognition that the 21st century has been one of growing variability, actually, in support for gender and sexual diversity, depending on where you lived. As this, I had mentioned Proposition 8 earlier, as this voting map of Proposition 8 indicates, and to be honest, this was kind of the real personal motivation for me to conduct this research, is when I saw this voting map and I really thought to myself, we're in a real change with regard to, used to be the national level was pretty much hostile toward gender and sexual diversity, no matter where you were, with the exception of some maybe urban kind of enclaves. But nowadays, there's just really a lot more variability, and yet the science that's out there tended to really under kind of represent those who were in would appear to be more potentially hostile or conservative areas. So lots of sampling done in urban centers and suburban areas of LGBT youth. So we wanted to focus on two distinct regions of the state, historically known for their support or hostility toward gender and sexual diversity. So here signified by these ovals, the San Francisco Bay Area and the Central Valley, clustered sort of around Fresno. And we had three questions. First, are these communities that different? As I said, they're historically known for being quite different, and this map suggests maybe they might be. But are they different, and how so when it comes to support for gender and sexual diversity? And assuming that they are different, how does this impact the identity labeling process? So I'm really interested in the development of identity for adolescents. So how might the community sort of impact that? And third, how is mental health impacted by living in these different types of communities? Now, we used three distinct methods. To address the first question, we used a community climate assessment tool, which was actually developed in Illinois, that looks at publicly available or community and institutional level data, such as the number of same-sex headed households in a particular county, the proportion of high schools with a gender sexuality alliance or GSA, or the proportion of supportive religious institutions in a community. So this is looking at publicly available data that doesn't involve surveying individuals or interviewing individuals. It's sort of taking that bird's eye view and codifying it quantitatively. So we were interested in doing that, and we think this kind of provides a, for lack of a better term, a sort of nice objective indicator of community climate. Now, we also gathered extensive data about the communities from 20 months of ethnographic fieldwork, including interviews with 52 informants, as well as administration of a survey of LGBTQ teens in the communities that asked direct questions about their impressions of the communities. And then to address questions 2 and 3, we used the ethnographic and survey data as well. So that's what we did. What we found, this graph provides a visual representation of our data from the community climate assessment, which I won't go into great detail in the interest of time, except to say that we found that indeed these communities are objectively different when it comes to indicators of support for gender and sexual diversity. And we also found these communities looked very different in their outward visible support for LGBT people. So think about the presence of pride flags and whatnot. And that young people indeed experience these communities as different in their interviews and the survey responses. I'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. When it comes to identity labeling, our data indeed revealed that we're in a new era of expansion, particularly around non-binary thinking. So one pattern across data sources that emerged was we found that almost a quarter of adolescents, again, these are adolescents affiliated with LGBT spaces, were using non-binary gender identity labels. And we found that this was more common in what we call high support or more politically progressive communities clustered around the San Francisco Bay Area, and also among those whose parents had higher education. The second pattern that emerged was that those assigned female at birth, signified by AFAB here, expressed more comfort with, or demonstrated more comfort with diverse gender expression than those assigned male at birth. And just as some quantitative indicators of this, almost 80% of those who were identified as non-binary had been assigned female. And we also found twice the number of out trans boys who had also been assigned female at birth than trans girls. So there was just an extraordinary higher level of visibility with regard to gender nonconformity and gender diversity in general among those assigned female. And the third pattern that emerged is that we found that adolescents used what we call plurisexual labels and asexual labels frequently. Plurisexual labels are labels like bisexual, pansexual, or queer. So about 61% of youth used these sort of more non-binary labels when it comes to thinking about sexual orientation and sexual attraction, and 10% use an asexual spectrum label signifying some degree of little to no attraction, sexual attraction, and consider themselves part of the larger LGBTQ community. And this is quite a bit larger than we find in general population studies, where it's about 1% identifying with an asexual spectrum label. And we did find that these were also more common among those assigned female at birth. And we don't find differences based on community with regard to the quantitative data, but qualitatively, we did hear a lot less about these kinds of identities in the more conservative areas. That doesn't mean that people, when surveyed, didn't use them. It just meant that they were in the air, in the discourse, a little bit less than in the Bay Area. So one theme that emerged kind of clearly from this aspect of the research was that those who are assigned female appear to be kind of leading this revolutionary moment in regard to gender and sexual diversity. And Sue is representative of those teens who talked about identifying with a plurisexual label. And I just want to quickly kind of read her narrative. She said, I was about 12 years old, I think. The way I found the label pansexual was the internet, which is really helpful, actually. I spent a lot of time online, messed around with a couple of labels until I found one that fit me because gender wasn't the thing that I cared about. And I wanted to highlight Sue's narrative because I think it shows the role of the internet and social media as tools for identity development, which I argue also reveals this more expansive view of community that today's teens have. If they're more kind of proximal community setting lacked resources, they often talk to us about going online to find information and support related to gender and sexual diversity. But as our research revealed, those assigned female were largely driving this more expansive view of identity labeling. They felt more empowered to depart from traditional notions of femininity than those assigned male felt towards masculinity. And I think that John's narrative kind of just provides a really comprehensible piece on this, where he says masculinity, especially at my school, is very important. I feel like a lot of guys, when it comes to if they want a name call or something like that, usually attacks masculinity, attacks their manhood. So John's story speaks to a pattern that emerged in our research in which, in particular, cisgender boys were the least involved in LGBTQ spaces, the least comfortable expressing their gender and sexual identities authentically if they did not conform to normative standards of masculinity. So I think that this shows that even though we're in this kind of revolutionary moment, there's a lot going on with regard to gender expression, masculinity, and much of this is also obviously tied to larger issues around gender and power in the culture that I won't go into right now, but I do think young people are, of course, part of all of these processes of social change. So the second big story I want to highlight is that LGBTQ youth appear to struggle in the midst of stigma, regardless of where they live. So in our survey sample, we found that experiences of prejudice and stigma were very common, with 41% of youth reporting victimization, such as bullying and harassment, that was directly related to sexual orientation or gender identity, and 59% reporting everyday discrimination, so like being treated differently in a store or at school, et cetera. And youth in more conservative communities did report hearing more explicit anti-LGBTQ remarks than those in more progressive communities. We found an alarmingly high level of depressive symptoms, with 41% of our sample scoring above an established clinical cutoff on very established measure of depressive symptoms, the CESD. And studies using this same screening measure with the general population of California teens find a 10% rate. So this is really alarming. And there were no differences in depressive symptoms across communities, meaning that those teens in progressive, high support communities like the Bay Area were still experiencing very high levels of stigma and accompanying mental health outcomes. And thankfully, we had this mixed methods design where we could ask a lot of teens about what was going on, and we could really interrogate this. So the paradox seems to be that although many youth are more empowered than ever when it comes to expressing their gender or sexual identity, this visibility does not translate into reduced stigma or better mental health. And this is, I think, where the complexity of communities really comes into play. I've already talked about the notion of a more expansive view of community in thinking about the positive role of the internet and social media for identity development. But let's kind of do a deeper dive on this issue of community complexity. When it comes to mental health, we find that progressive communities are indeed perceived by youth as more supportive in their self-report surveys, which I alluded to earlier. But youth in these communities have a particular narrative that is actually not as good as you might think or expect. And we find that conservative communities are indeed perceived as less supportive by youth, but that these youth actually have a narrative of it's better than you might think or expect, or it's getting better. So you can kind of see the way in which narrative meaning making of the community setting seems to kind of be canceling out the potential either pros or cons of living in particular areas. It's one way of thinking about it. And we found from the qualitative data that social media and the internet seem to constitute a kind of great equalizer in access to resources. But we find the endurance of basically the ideologies that underlie stigma, heterosexism, privileging heterosexuality, cissexism, denigrating transgender or non-binary or gender nonconformity, and just sex negativity in general seems to transcend the communities. And these cultural ideologies are precisely what we know from social science theory and extensive research. These are the ideologies that actually sort of allow bullying on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity to endure. So let me illustrate just really quickly with a couple pieces of narrative data. So Shayna, for example, talks about my community is conservative, definitely, and it's more scary. It's more of like, you have to face all of this and you can't be who you are because no one's accepting. You're kind of just trapped in your own little bubble and you're keeping the secret in that's pretty much eating you alive. You feel very trapped because you can't express yourself because it's wrong. So Shayna's narrative illustrates the psychological challenge teens have based on internalizing stigma, particularly in a conservative community. And Ethan says, I think that we benefit from being in the liberal Bay Area, but not quite as much as people would expect. Verbal bullying, physical bullying, mental health, suicide, self-harm, HIV infection, abuse, homelessness, every single one of these affects a student at this school. It's very much every statistic, every problem that you might imagine is there. I think the homophobic environment and bullying is a big issue in that. So Ethan's narrative is representative of those in the Bay Area who still talked a lot about homophobic bullying as a common experience. And finally, Sue's narrative speaks directly to actions we can take at the local and institutional level to serve the health and well-being of California teens, namely education. So she says, I want to see it talked about more in classrooms. I want it to be a more integrated part of the curriculum, because I think it could very easily be integrated into the curriculum if we had the organization to achieve that. She says, I want people to have to learn about it. What I want is for that information to be taught to all the people who would otherwise not get it. So let me wrap up, because I know I'm running a little short here on time, with just really quickly some concrete actions based on this research that I think would benefit the health and development of California teens. First, obviously, directly educating for sexual and gender diversity, teaching everyone through curricula that being diverse in terms of sexuality and gender is not a source of abnormality. Young people are mainly learning this in much more informal settings, and I think that that's problematic. We also need to commemorate things like Harvey Milk Day, Pride, etc., in ways that really illustrate the history of LGBT people. We can reduce stigma through policy, particularly anti-bullying policy. There's great science out there about the value of anti-bullying work when it focuses explicitly on sexuality and gender. And finally, recognizing and enhancing empowering settings. Young people talked extensively about the value of GSAs and community-based organizations. And this is a place where I think we really can do some very concrete work towards bettering their lives. But ultimately, we need to be interrupting this culture of prejudice and stigma from above, by which I mean we as adults in positions of authority need to be showing young people that we understand what sexual and gender diversity is, and that we are committed to changing the larger cultural narrative on what it means. So thank you very much to my funders and all my colleagues. And I think I've gone a little over time, so I'll stop talking there so we can have some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Professors Nishina and Professor Hammock for just a fantastic two fantastic presentations today. And so I'm just going to go ahead and give Brooke just a second here to go ahead and stop the recording.